what I'm suggesting is that when we talk about practical reason and practical philosophy, we're talking about, or political philosophy or ethics, we're talking about what the good being what is rational. And what that means, I think, is what is most developmentally, flourishingly optimal for a cooperative form of being. That relations that only are organized for the production of benefits for the few are fundamentally irrational.
All right, welcome back, friends and comrades, and welcome back to Michael Thompson, professor at William Paterson University and practicing psychoanalyst in New York City, and the author of Descent of the Dialectic, Phronetic Criticism in an Age of Nihilism, which I've just finished reading. And folks will remember that Michael joined me to talk about the work of the later Lukács on the ontology of social being. And you'll remember that Professor Thompson is, I think, at least in the US, one of the sort of most active scholars unearthing the mostly untranslated work of the later Lukács. And really enjoyed our first conversation, Michael, and I'm excited to dig into this new book of yours. I thought there's a lot of ways into this work. Frankly, it is a bit of a surprise to see a Marxist political thinker like yourself talk about and defend things like teleology or reason. You have a strong criticism, I think, here of Adorno, of Heidegger, right, of left-wing Heideggerian thought, and you center certain concepts that I'm going to want to invite you to sort of unpack. It's a very well-written, but also philosophically rigorous and very sophisticated book you've written here. Can we start off with the notion of dialectics as having descended? This notion of dialectics, and by the way, I think for folks that have a fond admiration for Aristotle, I really feel Aristotle is just sort of all over this text in a very interesting way, of course, which we can also talk about. But perhaps we could start with this notion of the descent of dialectics itself. Paint us a picture of what this means.
The title really refers to, I think, what has been a process, has been in process probably since at least the early part of the 20th century, which has been a process of a kind of organization of consciousness and a constriction of critical reflection on the part of modernity and modern human consciousness. And the powers of, and this is something that goes back to a lot of the insights of most of people who are non-Marxist, social theorists in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I'm thinking of people as varied as, Simmel and Weber, Thorstein Veblen. There's a whole host of the great thinkers of the late 19th, early 20th century who saw the great imbalance between system and self, between the capacity of the individual to be able to comprehend the social totality and the hypertrophy of the totality over the power of the individual to cognize it. So if you think about someone like Thoreau or Emerson or Whitman, in the United States in the 1830s or 1840s, there was definitely this struggle, again, of the individual's moral commitments against the system. It's one of the great themes of, Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. But it was this whole problem has been amplified exponentially, I think, ever since. And what's happened is this process of what I refer to as the subsumption of the self, taking from Marx's idea of the subsumption of labor in volume 1 of Capital, and tying this into what I think reification really is as a process, which is the capacity of the norms, of the logics of the system to be able to entangle themselves within the development of consciousness itself. So the dialectic, or this capacity to inquire into and look into the preconditions of our knowing what we know, gets increasingly disabled. It gets increasingly glossed over, and the already made set of norms and concepts gets kind of injected into us in this process. And that's part of what, I think Adorno was trying to address with negative dialectics, which was the idea of, like, you have to prevent this infiltration of reified norms and concepts from entering in. And I think the problem, though, with that strategy has been that preventing it is not really possible without understanding what the positive side of that would look like. That there's really no antidote to it unless it's conceptually abstract to try to resist it when you don't realize what the concept ought to look like. And I think there's a sense where dialectics, one of the reasons I start with Plato and with Socrates particularly, is because I really see that's the moment anthropologically and historically where critique really does begin. The ability to mediate and distance oneself from the world in which one is embedded. And this really, I think, does begin most powerfully with Socrates. And I think this capacity, not only this capacity, more importantly, the accent of modernity in terms of its Enlightenment trajectory has always been toward cultivating the concept of critique. I mean, it's the essence of what a robust democratic culture looks like. And I think Marx fits into this tradition rather than the tradition fitting into Marxism. Marx fits into this Enlightenment tradition of moving toward criticism, away from dogmatism. And I think that so the title really refers to this move away from criticism toward dogmatism. A descent of the dialectic means that, and this not only as a cultural phenomenon, but also at the level of the intellectual and theoretical discourse as well. So a move toward identity, toward existential themes, toward questions about group identity and groupthink. This is where supposedly progressive left politics has moved, as well as on the right. So we're moving in this space now where I think critique and judgment needs to be salvaged.
Right. And that's very helpful. And I think that there's a distinction that will help us dig a little deeper into the problem. Because part of what I really like about your work is that you're constantly encouraging your reader to think through the depths of the crisis that is facing humanity. And you're not shy to return to a position in support of things like humanism, right? Things like a deeper immersion into the ontological substratum. And I feel that distinction, which of course most philosophy students understand from Heidegger, the distinction between the ontic and the ontological, that is an intimidating set of words. Most people kind of are uncertain about that. But what you say,
Well, let me pause for just a second.
please.
Actually, I want you to continue the question, but I think it is true. There is some intimidating language, but the history of, but in a way, part of this is about kind of taking away the mysticism of these concepts. We can, the ontological, it sounds like a real heavy, it's a laden word. Philosophers don't always agree about what it's really denoting. But what I'm trying to suggest is that the ontological is, in its most important sense, the structure of human social being itself. And that trying to grasp what that is, and that means going back to concepts such as essence, such as what is the human, is essential for recreating and resuscitating a discourse on the left that is progressive, enlightened, and can reform a materialist politics that can actually transform reality and not simply remain entrapped in theory or in some alienated form of political discourse, some symbolic politics. So I think that the ontological really captures what is most decisive about what it means to be a human being. And that is the fact that we are relational and practical beings, that we are beings that this is the essence of what it means to be human. There's no such thing as a human phenomenon that is not somehow relationally constituted, number one. And number two, there's no such thing as being a human being without being an intentional, active being, that we act in the world according to thoughts and decisions that we make. And that this distinguishes us from merely natural beings. That we have the ability to choose different ends and purposes. We have the ability to choose how we articulate relations to others. That we have the ability to rethink it and redo. And this is what is ontological. What is ontic is what is frozen, what is assumed to be real, beyond our control, or maybe even unthinkable, or not an object of reflection. So the ontic, and the relations between Heidegger and Lukács have been probed, in a scholarly way by people as far back as Lucien Goldmann. But there is a parallel, and there's the argument that Goldmann puts forth that Heidegger was responding to Lukács in Being in Time, that there are these references to history and class consciousness, because Lukács was, I think, pointing to this nerve center in Hegelian Marxism, in Hegel and Marx, which became Hegelian Marxism, which was this very ontology, something he develops much later in the later work. But so when I think about words like ontology and ontic, they do sound very intimidating. But what's really behind them is, I think, a much more unmediated attempt to grasp what does it mean to be human? Because otherwise humanism does simply become this kind of, an inflated doctrine of whatever you want it to mean. That's not, we have to get away from all of this. First of all, it is prone to legitimate criticisms from postmodern and post-structuralist thought. But secondly, what do you have to face Trump? Renewed fascism and authoritarianism, the expansion of capitalism, of extractive reason. What do you have to confront this on the left, if not a robust humanist discourse to reconstitute democratic politics? I mean, I don't see anything that can reconstruct this from the core, and I think that's one of the reasons why the book might be a bit heavy lifting, because I think there's a lot of reconstruction to do. There's been decades of intellectual destruction, of enlightenment and progressive philosophy, and it's going to take a lot of work to move the stones, to reset the foundation.
So one other way to put what your argument is that this idea of alienated consciousness is not merely consciousness as thought as a cognitive or recognition-based phenomenon, but is much more expansive. It is phylogenetic. In other words, the pathological forms of capital have seeped into spheres of life and living in ways that are more totalizing than critical theorists thought they were, or theorized them as being. And that permits you to make a sort of reappraisal regarding the inadequacies of critical theory itself. And that's, evidenced in the title of your book, The Domestication of Critical Theory. And I felt that Lukács is a very, very interesting sort of captain of your ship in a certain way, at least philosophically, especially the later Lukács, in the sense that, he has this strong criticism of neo-Kantianism. And, in Kant, we have these things called the antinomies. And there is sort of an antinomy between the ontic and the ontological, just as there is between the is and the ought distinction. And Lukács says somewhere, and you quote it, that the is ought distinction, in terms of his understanding of ethics, is the limit. He says it's the limit of bourgeois ethics, right? And that bourgeois ethics relies on that antinomy. And then therefore you could say, at least philosophically, bourgeois ethics is caught within a neo-Kantian problematic for which it cannot sublate, cannot think outside of, and so on. So could you say something about perhaps that idea of neo-Kantianism that's going on here in these various antinomies that you're dealing with? Because you mentioned Lucien Goldman, and he is such a very, very profound critic of neo-Kantianism. We don't hear, it used to be common for Marxist philosophers to criticize neo-Kantianism. And I do see that in your work. I see a strong, because you're constantly saying, we need to rejuvenate the Hegelian, and you put a hyphen, Hegelian Marxist tradition against the Kantianism of critical theory. Say a little bit more, if you don't mind, regarding that. And is the ontological distinction posed in a kind of faulty way by left Heideggerianism, by left Heideggerians, such that it becomes a neo-Kantian antinomy? Is that a fair way to see it?
The first generation of critical theorists were in struggle with neo-Kantianism because of its relationship to the generation of positivism, of Windelband and Wundt and all these this whole Neo-Kantianism itself in the 19th century was a reaction to what it saw as the inflated metaphysics of Hegelian philosophy. And this was an attempt to place science and philosophy back into a scientific ground, which worked for the empirical sciences really well. The question in terms of ethics and the social sciences has meant that neo-Kantianism really, what happened after World War II was that neo-Kantianism slowly turned back into Kantianism. In other words, when you get Rawls and you get Habermas and you get this change in political and moral philosophy that happened in the 1960s and 70s, mainly it started in the 70s, but was gathering steam in the 50s and 60s, was a return to the idea of, for example, in Rawls, the theory of justice, or Habermas with the theory of communicative action, and inevitably discourse ethics, a Kantianism, which means a return to a procedural and formalistic solution to problems of questions of justice, the good, fairness, democracy, etc. But this returns us to this all assumes that all the questions posed by that first generation of critical theorists were solved. In other words, reification of consciousness. Well, if you have a proceduralist or formalistic approach to ethical questions, then how can you prevent, or how can you secure that reified content isn't being processed through the categorical imperative, for example, or any other kind of proceduralist or formalist doctrine? So it's not so much the neo-Kantianism the opposition between fact and value, of is and ought, is problematic. And it was problematic for Marx and Hegel for the simple reason that they were talking about ethical life more than ethics. So that rather than privacy, the privacy of of consciousness, the separation of mind and matter, or mind and society, they were trying to suggest that this is a false distinction. This is a distinction that's been created by this particular period in history. And Marx goes into this well, I think, in On the Jewish Question, for example, because it's the whole idea that says that there's political emancipation and then there's human emancipation. And political emancipation is not going to cut it anymore because it's going to lead to the paucity of liberal values and liberalism, for example. So I think when we talk about the distinction between the ontic and the ought, it is a diagnostic distinction. It's real, but it doesn't help us solve anything unless we're able to dissolve what's ontic and see what's ontological in the ontic. You, me, we are reproduced. Any book that you've ordered through Amazon, you're helping the system. I mean, let's be honest. And it's like, well, this is just what I do every day. It's very allied to psychoanalytic concepts such as displacement or repression or any of these kind of phenomena where I just don't want to acknowledge the things that I'm actually doing. And I think that a truly critical theory brings all of this back into play and places the burden back on us to try to change the system. And I think that that's something that, the second generation, third generation of critical theorists were trying to do with communicative action, with theories of recognition, but they simply, I think they just, their focus, their whole philosophical project, what they call post-metaphysical, is exactly doing that. It's leaving behind these ontological questions, these questions about what's fundamentally, objectively human.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the reason that this is significant is, like I said before, is that those doctrines that are anti-dialectical or not sufficiently dialectical, and I see Adorno's negative dialectics as insufficiently dialectical because it does not include what's positive, just the negation. What it means is that's almost a retreat to a kind of neo-Kantian position, because now I'm the one negating, like, well, I'm not going to participate. I'm letting this out because that's the only thing that's left, because society's gone to shit and now I can't participate in this anymore. And I always thought that Adorno kind of got this. I mean, it's a philosophically his own idea, but I always thought Adorno was more influenced by Benjamin's discussion of Baudelaire. That the image of Baudelaire sitting at the cafe, not participating in Parisian bourgeois society. It was like, I'm going to hold true to my poetic ideals, my aesthetic sensibility, right? That's Benjamin's great kind of portrait of Baudelaire. And I think, Adorno really looked up to this idea. I think he identified with it, him as the aesthete, philosopher, social scientist, who was able really adequately to diagnose the effects of the totality and the dynamics of the totality. I mean, the thing about Adorno is, there's almost like what's living and what's dead in Adorno is the relevant question, because the diagnosis is scarily right on. It's the question of like, well, how do we respond to this? And I think this is where Habermas took his cue. He knew, he's like, negative, this isn't going to cut it. You're not going to have a democratic politics with a bunch of people not participating like this. And so then you get the pragmatics and the theory of communicative action as a means of solving the problem. But back to the real question, I think Lukács saw that the truly radical moment, the turn that comes with Hegel, and actually probably before, I mean, to be fair, it starts really with Fichte. And the late Fichte's ideas about that there are two kind of functions of the mind. The one is to cognize concepts, but the other is to cognize concepts that will become acts in the world, that will be externalized in the world. And the fancy German word for this is Entäußerung. And this is a very fundamental concept in Hegel's phenomenology, right? That's the whole culmination of everything. And I think this is the basic concept of what Marx is talking about in the early manuscripts and the theses on Feuerbach. I mean, that's what we do. When you and I are having this conversation, this podcast is only possible because even though we've never physically met, we relate. We have the capacity to relate. We have the capacity to form a discussion around questions that other people might find interesting or not. But nevertheless, it is an intentional act. And this is something just like the shelves on the books that the books stand on behind each of us. These are objectified products of human consciousness. And that's the nucleus of freedom. That's the nucleus of freedom. We don't have to make bookshelves this way forever. We don't have to have discussions this way forever. This way of communicating and discussing ideas wasn't possible 20 years ago. So the question is bringing this more and more under democratic control, more and more under conscious, intentional volition, rather than just like, well, outsourcing this to the logics of system, which means capital, which means who controls the process of how people will relate, what people will produce, what you're allowed to think, what you're allowed to experience. And I think that's where the dynamic really becomes important, because for Lukács, and I think, Lukács is seeing this reflected in Marx and Hegel, that's what's distinctive about the Marxist tradition, what's the Hegelian Marxist tradition. Not the diagnosis of capitalism, which is also special to the Marxist tradition as a particular way of understanding political economy. But from a philosophical perspective, this is what's unique, that freedom is something to be concretized in the world rather than just a feature of the mind.
Yeah, exactly. It's beyond. In a way, it's trying to get to what Goldman called the trans-individual, not merely the individual, in the sense that it's not about intersubjective communicative understanding or recognition, which seems to somehow maybe only reinforce the status quo. So what we're sort of talking about is sort of what philosophically constitutes something truly revolutionary. And it's funny, as a side point, Professor Thompson, we just finished a long study of For Marx by Louis Althusser. And it's just so funny to read your work in light of Althusser's theoretical anti-humanism, where, all of this revolutionary thought of thinking social reality that Marx opens in the thesis on Feuerbach, for the proletariat, like a kind of philosophy as the heart of the movement, right? Althusser kind of shuts that down. He says, nope, we're not, that's not what Marxism is. And incidentally, that's why E.P. Thompson says the problem with Althusser is that he thinks that he's more Marxist than Marx.
Yeah.
Now, I don't detect a trace of Althusser in your book here. And you already just mentioned that Adorno's analysis and his critical analysis of the irrational and reified situation of capitalism is spot on, but there really is not an ethics. There's really not a political program. He famously says, a wrong life cannot be lived rightly. Is that the phrase?
That's right.
And I've always felt that this is kind of like a psychotic inducing formula. Really, right? I mean, what does that leave you with? Right? What does that really leave you with is my question for Adorno. And perhaps what it leaves you with is this task of critique for critique's sake, but nothing much more beyond that. Then you can cue up all of the funny pessimistic memes of Adorno. And frankly, I mean, I don't want to speak ill of him too much, precisely because the critique is so robust, but he has given Marxism a veneer of a profound pessimism. And I wonder if it's like how we can sort of, because I struggle in doing my show and being a man on the left. I will be honest that I do struggle with trying to penetrate beyond the pessimism of other philosophers, of other Marxists, and I'm not blaming that on Adorno. It's a systemic pessimism, and it's valid. But since you've invoked this idea of ethics, and you're trying to encourage us to actually invent an ethics, to say sort of this is what a Marxist ethics would look like, can we sit with that a little bit more? And can you elaborate a little bit more about ethics? It's interesting to me also that a lot of philosophers compose their ethics at the very end of their career as a homage to something ambitious that they often never finish.
Mm.
Why is that? And sort of maybe you could tease this out, because this is really a big part of your book.
I think we're living in an age that's decidedly anti-ethical, that increasingly reduces the human to what is animal, that increases, and I think is reducing the animal world to that which is inorganic. We're grinding the planet down. We're grinding down civilization and culture to its most basic functions. What is animal becomes human. What is human becomes animal. Marx famously said in the early manuscripts. And I think that an ethics is a necessary entree point rather than something that should crown the end of a philosophical career. It is instead the necessary entree point to the human condition at this time. Not psychology, not anthropology, not literature. It's the ethical question. And I think this is because there is so much on the line about what we're doing to the planet and to each other and to all living beings, the entire biosphere. But also because capitalism has morphed to the point now where what I call cybernetic society, I think we're leaving the neoliberal phase of capitalism, and we're entering a kind of this much more oligarchic, technically mediated system of society where the individual is subsumed by these transnational systems of production and consumption and behavior and normative forms of thought and being. And in that instance, I think we're encountering something that the species has never encountered before, which is a nature of totality that requires us to be able to think about what we're doing, what we participate in, and if there's going to be any transformation, if there's going to be anything that's not nihilistic, it's going to require a reinvention of our capacities as active, intentional, practical beings and relational beings. New forms of relational life will have to be opened up. New ways of thinking about, and let me just note for an example. I mean, like philosophy 101 class for most students starts with, or contains at least, the death of Socrates, those several, dialogues of Plato. And the first of them is called the Euthyphro. And the Euthyphro begins with Socrates meeting this guy Euthyphro at the courthouse. And Socrates is like, "What are you doing here?" And Euthyphro says, "Well, I'm here to bring a court case against my father." And he's like, "Why?" He's like, "Well, we got pissed off at this slave, and he tied him up. He beat him and tied him up and threw him into a ditch, left him there overnight. The next morning they came back. He was dead. And I'm bringing a case against my father for killing the slave. Even though my family was like, don't say anything. We'll just cover him up. No one's ever going to know." Right? And Euthyphro says, this is wrong. I'm going to go against my family because my father killed another person. And it opens up fundamentally with this ethical question about going against your family, something that in ancient Greece would have been, in a Mediterranean context, unthinkable to go against your tribe or your family. And it highlights, like Socrates does in the first book of Plato's Republic, what it means to think for yourself as opposed to thinking in terms of tradition, in terms of letting your emotions do the thinking, or in terms of thinking in terms of convention, which are the three other characters that are kind of talking to Socrates engage in. They represent that allegory. We are in this, but the stakes are so much higher. We are in this now where, those same forces are at work. But the Socratic, what Socrates represents, that of critique, of reason, of judgment, of reflection, of thought, is at its weakest as a cultural force, as a cultural ideal in our society. And that might be the legacy of the destruction of everything from World War II and onward, but I'm not sure. That's a different discussion and debate. But the importance of the ethical does seem to me to be the entree point to all relevant philosophical questions. Nothing else is relevant. And I think that's why Marx did do that kind of philosophical anthropology, because he knew that if you really want to know what freedom is beyond this liberal or Kantian formalistic conception of restrained freedom, of atomized liberty, then we're going to have to really understand what it means to be a human being. Hobbes tried to do it. And going back to what you said something earlier, I think about Goldman's idea of the trans individual, I really think the root of this, and I didn't talk about it as much as I should have, or maybe at all in the book, it's really Rousseau where the pivot really happens. Because it's Rousseau who starts to say, hold on a minute, civic human beings that live in a civic context, have to be able to think not only about themselves, but about the purposes of the association as a whole. And that forms the condition of judgment that says, should I follow this law? Is this institution valid? Should I agree with this? Does this really comport with what I think all people should do? I mean, it's the foundation for Kant's categorical comparative. It's the foundation, I think, for Hegel's philosophy of right. And I think it's the foundation for Marx's critique of capitalism. It's the idea, and ultimately Lukács and the rest, it's the idea that says, can I cognize myself as a social being, as a part of this cooperative project, which is society? Because make no mistake, the concept of society is itself an ethical category. It's not an empirical category, because the mere empirical idea that we live with other people is just collective life. What makes it a society, and the word social, this is an example of what I mean about the application of the ethical. Its root in Latin is fellows. That's what a socio is. Socii are fellows. We're fellows. If you're fellows, you're recognitive, kind of philigic, almost kind of civic friendship with others in cooperation for common ends and common goods. Society is a normative concept. We're not in that state, right? We live in a collective form of life, mediated, alienated, reified, treating other people as means rather than ends. This is not a society. An ethic, going back to questioning the ethical means, I think, going back to the anthropological question of, and ultimately the phylogenetic question, as you suggested before, of what the hell are we doing together? What is this? What is this thing that we call society? And I think that Marx, Lukács, the whole structure of thought, all of them, all the characters in various ways that are part of an ethical Marxist, critical humanist, whatever you want to call it, tradition, see this as central. That Althusser, by cutting this stuff off, and you can cut this off in the 1950s and 60s, for example, when you have a large communist party, in France, and who needs ethics when we can win the vote? But Lukács saw this. Lukács saw this from the point of okay, now we have real socialism or real communism, and it's just as alienated as capitalism is. It's just as corrupt. It just exploits people. I mean, right. He says this over and over again, and he says, we need to return to an ethic here.
And so in returning to an ethic, one of the things you say is that there needs to be a confrontation with value judgments, and you're not afraid to invoke values. When I say not afraid, I just mean that, there's a long 20th century Marxist tradition of criticizing social values as coming out of like sociology and Max Weber, and that is perceived as somehow un-Marxist. And you don't see it that way yourself. I want to invite you to say something about this notion of how citizens and the sort of subject of modern social life, how can we reasonably think, it's not only a question of their capacities, it's also a question of the phylogenetic basis. It's a question of interrogating this distinction that you draw between power and domination, and all of these different layers, right? Like, just as a quick anecdote to illustrate the depth of the problem, I was recently teaching an introduction to social and political thought, and there was a student who was very distracted in the class, and I called him out and said, "Do you understand what we're talking about?" And he said, "Yes, I very much understand, but I'm not ready to understand." Like, I'm. So he confessed that he was being challenged, but he also confessed that I'm not really ready to be challenged, right? Which made me think of your claim that, second nature, like the way that we think of society, it has a second nature. It's reified, and the mere task of the philosopher to challenge that second nature, that comes, as we know, in psychoanalysis, that comes a lot of defenses. I mean, my family, for example, is like a pro-Trump family, so I know a lot about defenses, and I'm sure you do too. So it's the task. The task is big, right? In terms of trying to sort of break down this thing, and even we have, and pardon my free association here, but it may be useful to you. We even have this trend of younger scholars in the humanities of what's called post-critique, right? Or the reparative turn, where they're saying, well, all of this critical theory hasn't really liberated society, so we don't really need to actually operate in that modality anymore. You can address that later, but perhaps you see where I'm coming from, which is help us dig deeper into this ethical challenge that we have, and sort of what are some of the ways that we might do that, and maybe even some of the ways we can do that beyond the classroom.
Well,
Because
yeah, for sure. The first thing is to see that value as an ethical phenomenon is definitely associated with the Neo-Kantian tradition, for sure. But I think one of the things I'm trying to suggest is that it isn't, and number two, by not being value in a Neo-Kantian sense is something that's cognitive, is conceptual, is something that I carry within me. And this is something that comes out in this not debate, but this discussion in letters that Weber has with Ernst Troeltsch, about, and after Troeltsch published his big 2-volume book on the history of the Christian churches, and the idea that Troeltsch is kind of capturing is the idea that, wait a minute, maybe value wasn't just something people carried in their head; it's something they did. They created these communities, like, that were based on, and the early Christian communities are fascinating examples of this, of realizing, objectifying value in the way that they related to others, in the way that they practiced, in the way that they behaved and treated people, that their practices and their relational world, their ontology, transformed. And it is a major moment in history, when with the same thing happens with the Buddha in the East, or with Socrates in the spread of the Socratic, um, you know, um, kind of mode of thinking and questioning that spreads through the Mediterranean, that a new conception of what it means to be a person, what Karl Jaspers called the axial age. Axial meaning from axios in ancient Greek, which means value, not Wert in German, not economic value, but the idea that the human being is worthy of being an object of inquiry and care. That Socrates moved scientific, reflective thought from thinking about stars and, the nature of things, right, of stones and water and all this previous pre-Socratic philosophy, and moved it toward the human being. That you are an object of care and learning and study, and that is parallel what's happening with the Buddha. That's parallel what's happening with Jesus. It's happening of Nazareth. It's going on all over the place in this period, this broad period of history, and it's a kind of fulcrum point. And I think I see the Enlightenment, and I do contain Marx within that Enlightenment kind of rupture. That's another turning point. It's another axial age that we have lost touch with. That the idea that human value is significant to the extent that it is realized in the world, not when it's just, this is my value, this is something I value. That's a hypocrisy. It's a contradiction. It's non-dialectical. Because what's dialectical in an ontological sense is when what is abstract or thought or cognized becomes real in a teleological sense. What makes us human beings is that we are teleological. And Marx's great philosophical contribution to this whole tradition is that he took Hegel's concept of a historical teleology and made it deflated it into it being an actual property of what it means to be a human being. That right now, when I want to convey something in my mind, that I move my tongue and my mouth to make air move in a certain way, that your eardrums, that vibrate your eardrums in a particular way that you are able to decipher as language. And I'm actually, this is what labor is for Marx. It's poietic. It's literally production, produco, to lead out from oneself. That's what the Latin word means. So there's a sense in which, yes, repression. If you're I am certain that there is a core of Trump supporters who are, and I think it's small, who are legitimately kind of sadistic or animated by sadomasochistic personality disorder kind of needs, I'm sure. But for the most of them, I believe that their support for this kind of politics is itself because their own sense of value has been frustrated, that they're not living in a human world. And I think that is where the sense of human value can form a pretext of like how you can get people to start talking about transforming the world. And that's why in the book I talk about the Greeks so much, because they did see that this was the case. I think Plato saw this. I think Aristotle saw this. And I think Hegel and Marx saw it, that really what counts is what's ontological. Phylogenetically, we have certain capacities, but the society into which we are born works them up, organizes them in particular ways according to the distribution of power of that society. And that becomes the ontogenetic ways that we formulate relationships in either defective, pathological, or freedom-enhancing form. But the question is, how do we begin to look at that and say, wait a minute, what am I doing when I treat a friend this way? When I treat my wife this way? When I, treat my pet this way? It's like, what am I doing? What is this? Like, is there a way that I can reclaim the value and start to change the way I behave and what I do? And that ultimately reverberates outward.
Right.
That I'm living in a world of institutions that I believe are in conflict with human value, with putting human freedom first.
Right. And I think the funny thing is everything you're saying sounds like familiar to me, but maybe unfamiliar to many readers of critical theory, because this is not the vision that critical theory has bequeathed to
Well,
our
let me say
our
something
generation.
about that,
Yeah.
because I think it depends. There's a certain hierarchy which I mean, when I discovered critical theory as a student in the 90s, nobody was reading this stuff. Like in the mid 90s, it was very few. Even though there were a lot of translations around, there were a lot that wasn't translated. And I discovered, Marcuse and Lukács and Fromm and Adorno. I just thought this was just exciting because it was like really getting underneath what I felt was really false in the world. Like I felt that the music and the movies and the culture I belonged to was kind of puerile and wasn't didn't hit me like it didn't. It just seemed, kind of commodified. And there were a bunch of these thinkers that showed this. But when you go a little bit deeper, it depends on whom you read. I mean, if you read critical theory through the lens of Adorno, I do think that's going to be the accent, and Adorno and Horkheimer. But what if you entered critical theory through Erich Fromm, for example? I think you would see critical theory and Hegel and Marx in a really different way, more dialectical, more tied to questions of ethics, more tied to questions of human value, and more tied to questions of praxis.
Yeah. Well, even in the very idea of what reason is. I mean, if you say that reason is not merely epistemic, but reason also encompasses value itself. And that is interesting because you also reference this idea of irrationalism a little bit. It's not a major focus, but you do talk about it. And then one can see that something like Trumpism and the pathological systemic basis that makes Trumpism possible is also not merely an erosion about like, the line New York Times or some sort of like, some fake news or the cultural politics of the left. No, it's actually much deeper than that. The erosion of pathological forms of domination have seeped into reason itself. And if reason itself is understood as containing value, and I want to invite you to say something about that, because that will then bring us to this very important concept of practical reason. Well, we can see then the stakes. So what I like about your work is that you're sort of upping the ante on what's at stake here. If it was merely epistemic, then we could kind of correct it with better knowledge or, better reason. No, reason is also a practice that's lived and embodied and is far deeper than that. Perhaps you might introduce that. And that's why I said Aristotle. I don't know if you are Aristotelian or how you piece that together, but it just makes me. Could you say something about that? And then we can build into this idea of practical reason, perhaps.
I think this is a very important phenomenon. I think all of us who were born, raised, and educated after the middle of the 20th century were kind of taught about reason as being kind of like science, that science and reason were this almost interchangeable terms. And that's an aberration of what the whole philosophical discourse of reason had been since the Greek world. And Marx, I think, is, and I think Hegel also, I mean, one of the things that they're contributing is this idea that is a kind of embedded form of reason, an embedded rationality. That rationality is embedded with value. That and people often will invoke in the social sciences and the human sciences also invoke, Weber's famous objectivity essay about the separation of facts and values and the idea of neutrality and restraint of value. But I'm like, that's itself a value. If I say I shouldn't color, my, religious belief shouldn't color whether or not, the sun operates the way it operates is one thing, but that's a value. Science, natural sciences works with an embedded reason also. I think one of the things that's significant here, and Marx, this is volume 1 of Capital, even if you don't read 2 and 3 or the Grundrisse, if you just read volume 1, it's an embedded form of reason. And when I say that, what I'm suggesting is that when we talk about practical reason and practical philosophy, we're talking about, or political philosophy or ethics, we're talking about what the good being what is rational. And what that means, I think, is what is most developmentally, flourishingly optimal for a cooperative form of being. That relations that only are organized for the production of benefits for the few are fundamentally irrational. They're irrational in the sense that, they're not for the ends, the good of all. And that's not an arbitrary decision. That's a decision, or an arbitrary value. I think that's a value that's grounded in the phylogenetic capacities of human beings and the purposes and reasons why we work together and live together. Not, you could say that the Egyptians who built the pyramids were irrational, even though it's a form of rationality that's remarkable to build these architectural things. But, if you go to Egypt, those are the only things that you see. You don't see all these public works and apartment buildings and all these things. The only thing that stand that the entire society was organized toward the afterlife of one person. And I think that's a standard of domination that persists in our world today. That, that the few have this kind of extractive power for their own ends, for their own benefits. And that we today, in a post-religious kind of environment, can say, wait a minute, what should our activities and practices be organized toward? And I think that's why I emphasize this concept of Phronetic criticism, because I think we need to return to the concept of bringing reason and science back into the ethical sphere. In other words, science has to be embedded in ethical questions. I mean, should we, if we were able to, should we bring back a brontosaurus? I mean, it's like, what the hell are we doing here? I mean, this just happened with the dire wolves, right? It was a couple of weeks ago. This company brought back the dire wolf, this extinct species, but they did it for one reason, I think, which is like, how are we gonna collect capital? How are we going to get investors to throw us cheap money that the Fed keeps printing? Just how Elon Musk made all this money. I mean, it's science that's disembedded from ethics is just as destructive as economic life disembedded from ethics, which is what capital becomes, right? Capital is just this incessant, translation of human productive value into monetary value. I mean, that's all this is. It's just about quantification of value and the alienation of labor. And I think that this process of disembedding is what phronesis puts back together. Phronesis says, something, you don't need to recreate a woolly mammoth or a brontosaurus or whatever the hell they're doing. It's a question of human needs, human values that can be discussed, it can be, collectively decided, but we have to have what's humane and what's and the fact that we can just decide and adjudicate what the ends and purposes of our cooperative activities are. That to me is the nucleus. That's the core of what this whole struggle is about. I think it was the case of the Enlightenment. I think it was the case with Marx's theory of communism. Like, however we might think about how those things have aged over time is one thing, but the impulse was always to bring human life as much as possible under conscious direction and control. And phronesis is a way of bringing that back. And that is Aristotle's core concept of practical reason.
Yeah. And yes. So, I love, by the way, McIntyre's work on the practical reason of socialists. He has this wonderful book where he goes through the biographies of prominent socialist figures, my favorite being C.L.R. James, where he shows the evolution of their modality of using their practical reason and how it changes over time based on the circumstances that they find themselves in. And of course, one of the other things that you talk about is a very important distinction between domination and power. Now, in Marxist studies with Mikhail Heinrich and Moishe Postone, we are informed by the great Marxologists that capitalism is a system of impersonal domination. And therefore, power is not to be fetishized, as the locus of individuals. I mean, I've been having this huge debate about imperialism on my program and have referenced Postone's argument that the anti-imperialist left, he argues, fetishizes power because they think that everything that is oppositional to the United States imperial project is good, right? Unfortunately, he also has a perhaps a Zionism agenda, which I question, subtending that argument. But where do you fall? And you do reference the Republican tradition in a positive way, I think. So I'm kind of moving to politics now to fit that in here. Because in a certain way, you say a very important thing, which is social power is the efficient cause of social forms. And there is therefore the task in thinking ethics, in thinking this way out of reified, alienated consciousness, to contend with power. How do we contend with power while also dealing with structural domination, which for us as agents often is extremely elusive, abstract, and depersonalized in a certain way? Do you need to take a break for the dog? I can also put it on pause.
No, he's fine. He's just kind
Good.
of prancing around. He'll be all right.
Okay, give me 1 second here. Just pause. Okay, I needed a little so I know when to edit. Okay, please continue.
The question of power versus domination is a significant one. Power is a capacity to do. And I think that's just a basic semantic definition. Domination is the misuse of power to extract benefit from another, to extract surplus benefit for another. So that becomes, as far as I'm concerned, part of the basic grammar of a critical politics. Structural domination I find to be a largely fallacious idea. And I think there's a fetish over this concept because it's a way of saying, well, there's all this power out there, like, what are we going to do about it? The real question goes back to Gaetano Mosca, I think, in his, it's a non-Marxist work, but it's a great work on political sociology, which in English is translated as On the Ruling Class, which tells you how, the Italian title is just Principles of Sociology. But Mosca wants to ask, he wants to know, how is it that a ruling class is possible? How can the few dominate the many? And his answer is like, well, there's pretty much one way only. You have to disorganize the many in order that the efficiency of the organization of the few amplifies its power. So the idea of the structural domination seems fallacious to me because its very concept is reified. In other words, there's this power out there. There are these structures. What the hell am I supposed to do? But the problem is the source of those structures of power really come from us. That we are the ones who give those people the roles and the statuses that they have. And you can see this throughout 19th century history of politics, that or in 20th century too, that when you had general strikes, when you had, or even earlier on, when Machiavelli in his discourses talks about the tumults of Republican Rome, but also of his own time, when the Florentine Republic was established, that the people are just like, I'm done with this. I'm finished. I'm not going to cooperate with this anymore. And there's disruption, and those power systems collapse overnight. Structural domination is empirically, something there, but if you penetrate a little bit deeper, what you realize is that it's really a functional question, a question of functionalism. In other words, the systems of norms that you have uptaken get reproduced through you. The only reason that the Pharaoh is not because he commands all these armies, it's because all these people think he's Pharaoh and grant him that status. So it's a construction, it's an ontology. And that's why I go back to the ontological, because the ontological is real, but it's also non-physical. It's non-material, but nevertheless objective and real. And that's what makes this significant, that if we begin to change systems of value, systems of thinking, and systems of norms, we start to shift the nature of power. And domination is, I think, the idea that it's personal versus impersonal is one thing, but I think it's a non-dialectic way of looking at it. There can be capitalists, and I think in the age of neoliberalism, the arbitrary nature of arbitrary power has been accented under capitalism. In the 1950s or 60s, it would have been the boardroom, and making decisions, and you could have said this was much more system oriented. But in today's day, after the neoliberal, transformation, moving us to a post-social democratic kind of order, individuals have much more arbitrary power than they did before. Jeff Bezos can basically turn the Washington Post into whatever he wants right now. The person who owns the LA Times can do the same thing. Elon Musk is transforming the state as an individual. The idea that there isn't dominant, and this is all done for personal gain. All of it's done for personal gain and the extraction of surplus. The idea that this isn't domination, the idea that this isn't a system of personal domination that's accenting the logics of system seems to me to be just fallacious completely. There's a way that if Marxism does not return to being a living, growing doctrine of thought, a paradigm that can shift with elasticity of the time, then it has no more relevance. If we're going to simply trot out again and again, well, hey, that's what capital does. The world's falling apart. Well, hey, got capitalism. This is what it does. Marx told us this. This is an absolutely unhelpful, system of thought, and it's definitely not what Marx intended by writing Capital.
Mm-hmm.
The intent was, look, everyone, we need to wake up and we need to do something.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the problems of Marxism as an ism, as opposed to it being that seeing Marx as another spoke in the great wheel of critical thinking, is that we reify Marx. We reify Marxist ideas. And we fail to be able to see how they can change and transform and change with the time that we're living in.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that when we say that Marx had a teleology, we mean that in two ways. On the one hand, I'm thinking of Gramsci's article, which is very short, and I mention it a lot on my show, but I think people should read it, on 1917, called "The Revolution Against Capital," where he says, "Look, the Bolshevik Revolution showed us that the teleological conclusion of the capitalist system, the overcoming, the socialist revolution in Russia, was not the way that Marx predicted it in Capital, right?" And incidentally, that's where this question of voluntarism, of the will of the people, of Rousseau, even of Nietzsche, kind of comes in a certain way. That, in other words, that the system does not sort of structurally implode based on its own internal contradictions. So we have that question. And then we have the other question, which brings us back to the early Marx and the essence of the human and what you see as the ethical core of Marx, as putting forward this idea that the human in capitalist society is not permitted to self-posit their own ends, right? Which is the idea of the fact of what makes us human, is that we can do that. And in order to do that, we invent our own telos. Yeah. Now you want to make a claim against, I guess you could say, all Thusserian anti-humanist Marxism, that no, indeed, that thrust of Marx remains. It remains constant. It's not somehow washed out after 1845. This has been a huge debate in Marxist thought. Can you say a bit more about how you understand teleology and Marxism, perhaps from these two vantage points, both of the question of the human essence, but also from this systemic? Because I think it's related to this what you call fetish for structural domination, which I agree. The downside of it is political. We remove Marx as a practical political doctrine, in my view.
I think, first of all, the question of teleology as it is an organizing principle throughout Marx's work. I think the idea of the coupure epistémologique, the rupture, the epistemological rupture, I just don't think it's true. I don't think it's textually, I don't think you could textually validate this. Throughout Volume 1, Marx is constantly making reference to ideas that he developed in 1845 and 1843. And start with 1843 for a second. Start with that famous, little fragment on James Mill's Political Economy, where he kind of dialectically sublates recognition with teleological production, where he says, what if I produced, for you because I wanted to make something for you as a human being, that I saw you as human and I wanted to make you something, where I may make you a meal or produce something for you. And then you did the same for me. There's a form of reciprocity, that Polanyian idea of like reciprocity going on. He's like, that would be a society that you could counterpose to the one where it says like, I simply produce for the market, or I just produced for personal profit. And he's showing, I think, this idea that says like, that's a living way of organizing relationships and production. Then, of course, you have the 1844 manuscripts, but then you get the theses on Feuerbach, which, if you do a close reading of, is a remarkably deep transformation of philosophical anthropology. And I think, actually, if you look at the left Hegelianism out of which Marx is coming, and the people who are like, you think of Feuerbach, of course, but you think of like Tchaikovsky, some people don't read anymore, mainly because the book's not in English, which is really, really a shame. But but Tchaikovsky's idea of his transformation of Hegel was significant, because he's saying that Hegel, in addition to the idea of the in and for itself, there also has to be the out of itself, the aus sich, right? It has to come, that the individual is making this world of houses and bricks and books and speeches and universities and hospitals. This all comes from within us. It's all an externalization of what's in our, again, the Entäußerung idea. Marx goes back to this again and again in Volume 1 of Capital. I mean, almost every several pages as a reference. The famous one being, of course, the ants and the beavers, right? And then there's the human being and the idea of the architect. What makes the human architect superior to any bee or beaver is the fact that it's in thought first, and then it gets externalized in the world. But the point of that is not just to say, hey, we're different. It's to say, like, no, this is the material nucleus of a new theory of freedom. That to be free is to say, wait a minute, these are ends that I have self-authorized. This world is an intentional world. not a world robbed from me, where my labor power is rented, extracted from me in order for some surplus gain for the few, for an oligarchy, or for the particularist, aspects of the community. No, 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 wait a minute. A truly intentional community would say, where are our efforts and sources and our powers supposed to be invested? And and again, Marx says this is like, there's one of the passages again. This is like, let's imagine a society of free producers. He says, what would that world look like? So he moved from this empirical discussion of the logics of capital, and then for a paragraph delve into what I guess the anti-humanist would call something normative. But the thing is, normativity is baked into the very concept of what it means to be a person. If I decide to talk to you, I'm following a norm. Every social fact is normative. There is no separation of, oh, this is normative and this is. It's like, no, no, wait a minute. You don't understand. The whole world is organized and shaped by norms. Earthquakes aren't. Hurricanes aren't. But Ford Motor Company is. And Amazon is. The whole thing is a congealed network of norms. That means people who adopt them, who follow them, who see them as legitimate, or don't question or think about them. Capital is not a material thing. It is an ontological thing. It is the result of a series of norms that people over time have taken as second nature. And you can see this in the 19th century, in American history, where Marx got a lot of his ideas about political economy, by the way, were from those thinkers from the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s in America who were fighting against the rise of the institution of wage labor, because in their mind, this was a return to slavery, and the idea of a republican, what they had fought against. And these guys were basically like saying, like, if you accept this system, we'll be the ones that are going to feel it the most, but our kids and our grandkids are going to accept it without question. And Rousseau says this too in the 18th century. The first slave had to be broken. The first slave had to be broken to pieces. But it's his children and his children's children, they're going to grow up as slaves, as passive kind of, carriers of that status. And I think that's why I think the idea that says the humanistic is separate from the scientific, the normative is separate from the empirical, this is itself a neo-Kantian obfuscation. And by the way, that's really doing disservice to neo-Kantians, because there are some of the great neo-Kantians of the 20th century who were extremely ethical and practical people, even though they were non-Marxist. Doesn't matter. People like Leonard Nelson, no one reads this stuff anymore, unfortunately. But there was a huge, robust discourse about how you realize value in the world. And I think Marx is part of this. I think that the idea of what's normative has to be understood as the basis of what social facts are, as opposed to natural facts. And I think that is the fundamental root of de-reification. And we see that we are participating in the very structures of domination that these theorists tell us are imposed upon us.
Right. No, it's very interesting. I mean, it reminds me of Alain Badiou's preface to his second volume of Being in Event Logics of Worlds, where he says that, kind of revising Althusser, because Althusser's position was polemical internal to the French Communist Party, that
Right.
any humanism will reinforce the status quo of bourgeois ideology, and therefore dialectically it's not sufficient. It kind of just reproduces bourgeois individualism. And that's why anti-humanism in his conception had a certain edge. It had a certain negative power. Badiou's like, well, yeah, but what happens when the capitalist ideology of the ruling class becomes itself anti-humanist or becomes antisocial, which it is and which it can do.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's a certain question, I think, of ideology as well. And I did want to broach ideology with you. It's not a concept that you talk about a heck of a lot in your book. But maybe I might ask you where it might fit. For example, the ideology that school that of my own training, coming out of like Lacanian psychoanalysis, has a very Spinoza-oriented idea of ideology, as really there's no outside to ideology, and it's kind of imaginary misrecognition, and again, it's a kind of pessimism, I would say, in general. I don't get the feeling for you that ideology is like that, because you do want to present a positive vision of something like a dialectical mutation of ideologies, of dominant ideologies, of how we're interpolated in dominant ideologies, that in fact we can think outside of them, right? Otherwise, what's the point of doing philosophy, of trying to change the world? So could you maybe say something about ideology and how it works for you here?
Well, I think that there's a way in which, if all worlds are just imagined worlds, then there's really no point. There's no Archimedean point for thought. So it sets up the relativism of postmodernism and post-structuralism. I think what's really important about returning to humanism and returning to an ontological conception of human essence is that you need a ground for ethics. You need a ground for human value to say what's valid and what is not valid. And you need a theory of validity in order for there to be a question of legitimacy of institutions and social norms and practices. And that itself forms the basis for a politics of dissent versus a politics of obligation. So when there's a fundamental idea that comes from Hegel's dialectic, which is that, you're defined by what you oppose. So, I mean, with Althusser, it's very clear, it's like, well, look, we're going to oppose the scientism of the prevailing reality with our own scientism. But that doesn't get you anywhere. When you're defined by what you oppose, you're really also masquerading in your own form of ideological kind of mirroring and shadowing. I think what's really significant is, and again, when I see Marx as part of a project, an intellectual project of critique, rather than sui generis, is that we do need this Archimedean point. We do need this point because we're entering a world of such incoherence, ethical incoherence, that we no longer have a standard for judgment and critique. And if you don't, then democracy really does collapse. You really do want the strong man in power because you're like, I don't know what the hell the right thing to do is. Anyway, I just need a job, or I want my wages to, or I don't want these immigrants here, or whatever. You're going to outsource, increasingly outsource your rage and frustration and anger toward a kind of a reactionary authority. But the rage and the anger, as psychoanalysis teaches us, is really the result of the frustration of not receiving love and not receiving reciprocal forms of relatedness that enhance us. That's the real origins of hate. It's the frustration of love. It's the negation of love. It's the turning away of the mother's breast from the baby leads the baby to hate this thing that it needs. And I think there's a way in which ideology is ideological itself when it hasn't undergone that fundamental process of critique. And Kant had this right from the beginning, of dogmatism versus criticism. Are you aware of the very preconditions that generate the concepts that you're using? We as human beings, we are concept users. This is how we organize experience, phenomenal experience of the world. The question of relevance here is, what are the validity of the concepts that I'm using to mediate and organize the phenomenal experience of the world? When they're heteronomously given to us and installed within us, critique becomes all the more important. Because otherwise I reproduce that world as natural. Hobbes, the very beginning, the first half of Leviathan, is a whole anthropology of what man is. And it's horrible, because he's reading off of what he sees and naturalizing. This is the Holy Family, and Marx and Engels go through this. And I think that's why the return to saying, like, what does it mean to be here? And this is a very difficult question. And by no means can one single book or one single thinker really encapsulate it. But I think one way into it is to start to try to understand how we are historical beings, practical beings, and relational beings, and how those capacities get reshaped and reorganized by different periods of time, and how that can be reclaimed for intentional purposes and ends. That we can say, you know what, we can learn from our experiences too. And I think we do with this all the time. Or maybe not everybody, but hopefully most of us do. That we learn about what friendship is by having more friends. And what bad friendship is teaches us, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to be a friend with a person like this. Or I don't think I want to date a person who treats me this way anymore. These experiences build up within us a sense of what kind of life we're going to live. And I think that's why Plato wrote these dialogues. They are therapeutic, and and a lot of times, Plato will subtitle some of his dialogues to subcategorize them. And one of the subcategories he has is maieusis. It's maieutic. In other words, it's a matter of obstetrics, of being born, of becoming anew. So some dialogues are intended for you to kind of almost be reborn again. And I think like that dialogues like the Lucis, and like where he's talking about friendship and the capacity to know what friendship is and realize it in the world.
Yeah.
It's no different in our political and civic civic life,
Right.
I believe. And I think that's why this is really an important question to reconsider, because ideology is what results when you don't question the premises of the concepts that you employ in the world.
Mm-hmm. 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 Or, I mean, I've had the observation, I don't know if you would agree with this, that there's an interesting difference maybe between our generation and past generations in intellectual life, whereby a lot of intellectuals in the 20th century used to have strong demarcating points where their views changed, and they generated profound exertion of thought to account for the change of their ideologies or how they saw the world, their worldview. Whereas today I don't know if we're more dogmatic, but we don't have that same introspection as much. And maybe that is a reflection on what people call post-ideology or post-politics, or the sense in which political events are not in our measure as much as they were in the 20th century. But perhaps, that because there's also this big debate that your work, I think, introduces, in any question of humanism introduces, is the question of personality. I mean, one of the, Althusser has had a lot of publicity in Marxist studies, but one of his great interlocutors was this guy Lucien Sèvres.
Mm-hmm.
And after Sartre, what did Sartre dedicate the majority of his time to? Biography, human personality. What's biography, right? Yeah. And he thought that he could untangle a Marxist ethics by penetrating into biography. And I find that very interesting,
the Flaubert
work.
It's just incredible.
Yeah, and because he also thought that he could identify what he called the objective neurosis of the age through a biographical portrait of an individual of that age, right? And so we're talking humanism, and so maybe what might be some of the projects that a renewed humanism might bring forth? Would it be things like a study of biography, recentering? Does that make sense? Like, what does that mean for art? What does that mean for aesthetics? What does that mean for literature?
Yeah, I think it's crucial. I mean, I think Lukács did something parallel to Sartre, because Lukács's majority of his work after from the 1950s onward, I mean, even before this, he was doing this, were literary studies. Studies of Thomas Mann, studies of the history of bourgeois literature, of Balzac, of German realism. I mean, there's just
Oh yeah,
endless reading.
Holderlin, Goethe, you name it. I mean, even the conversation on Shakespeare in
Yes.
Ontology of Social Being is fascinating, because he says, you know, what were the material social conditions that made Lukács develops a preliminary thesis of what the material conditions of genius are.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting intersection with your question, because in many ways, if you're not reading Melville and Whitman and Emerson and Tolstoy and Shakespeare and Sophocles, but also if you're not reading Confucius and you're not reading the Upanishads and you're not reading, the Conference of the Birds or something, if you're not in touch with the project of human beings trying to live a human life, and it's everywhere in all the great books, whether you agree with their solutions or not, there's a sense in which all these great books are really the exploration of the human experience. And I think the extent to which our culture has become deliterate, and I mean this practically as well as, it's just completely deliterate, is the extent to which we also lose contact with that tradition. Because I don't know, we could have this debate, I suppose. I don't know if things were any easier for people in 1913, politically. I mean, there was less democracy. You couldn't even vote for senators in 1910, right?
Well, I mean, I think of Freud's group psychology as an imminent response to Gustave Le Bon in his work on the masses. And what we do, I think it is true that, like the Spartacist uprising or 1917, well, they had charismatic leaders on the one hand, and they had the force of the streets and an insurrection which could topple a regime.
Yeah.
And, one of the things, my mentor, Alain Badiou, I interviewed him once in Paris about Tahrir Square, in Egypt. And I had the feeling in hindsight, that that the masses don't possess the same power as they did.
Well, they don't. But also, I think it's because it's a question also, I think, of disorganized masses, or are you talking about organized political forces? So that's also another question sociologically. The question about recontacting with projects of a renewed humanism, I think, is meant to shine light on what it is that to re-enter into a discourse about, like, what Kant kind of touched on in the second two critiques, which is how should I behave? How should I act? What should I do? And what should I hope? I mean, these are really these fundamental questions that aesthetic sensibility can help us with. But in an age of commodified aesthetic experience, when art is dead, effectively, that's itself a symptom, I think, of a more general collapse of the human from the late 20th century onward. That in literature and in painting, that we no longer have a vibrant world where that symbolism, that symbolic discourse is taking place. So, like any dark age, you have to look to the past. Like any dark age, you have to look to the past, because when people were asking those questions, in order to reinvigorate that question now. And my students, when I teach my students and we read not just philosophical texts, but we read literary texts, I have them read some bits of poetry from Walt Whitman, or parts of Shakespeare or Sophocles. They're enlivened by this. It's not like this is a choice that intellectuals have made to destroy these canons, to destroy these traditions of texts and thought. And it's not helping any kind of progressive cause. It helps, and if anything, it helps the status quo. So humanism has to go back also in educational terms and say, we need to be probing these questions again, not acritically. I mean, you're not going to read Moby Dick the way you would have in 1950. Good. That means it's even more alive of a text. But then it does make you think about the connections of like, well, while Melville was writing this, Marx was writing that. And then how do you forge these connections? And how do you start to say like, okay, well, what does it mean? What kind of world do we live in? We can transpose those questions to today. That has to happen within the educational sphere. That's in my view. And that's not happening. And if you are an educator and you are involved with the university, which are being attacked now by the right in an existential way, then there's going to be no resource left. It's the last vestige for where this can happen. And I think that's why the fight has to be taken internal to those institutions, that we have to defend when administrators say that not enough people take your theory course, we're going to cancel it, or we're going to get rid of literature and merge it into the languages department, or whatever. That these are just as existentially important a fight as the EPA ripping down rules about the Clean Air Act.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's been a debate since I think the 90s culture war saga on the within the American humanities about the perceived over politicization of professors, which even J.D. Vance, and I don't really see this claim as authentic, saying something like the professors are the enemy, and this very weird right-wing weaponization of professional managerial class theory, which is partially explains the liquidation or the attempted liquidation of the American bureaucracy currently happening right now under Doge. That's James Burnham, right?
Yeah.
That's the return of Burnham, and it's what's interesting about that is the idea that, as I see it, there's not a constituency to it's happening in a way where there's not sufficient pushback or challenge of that. That's quite startling. I think it shows that perhaps campus politics were co-opted and maybe we could say artificially politicized. So maybe what I hear you saying is that is there a way to fortify a more robust form of politics in academic humanities? Obviously you're on a podcast right now, which is adjacent to, this is not a part of a university system. And I'm very careful about para-academic work because I know that it's very difficult resource-wise to sustain it. And in this society, you can't, every time you apply for a job, if you took 2 months off, the employer asks you, what were you doing for those 2 months?
Mm-hmm.
Not the 60s anymore.
Yeah.
We don't have that leisure time anymore, right? There's a discipline for young people, labor discipline. And so having the luxury to study is huge, and you need the university for that. So I don't want to be anti-university. Like, Guy Debord was anti-university. I'm not anti-university. I'm highly critical of the university. I don't know if I have a question, Michael. I'm reflecting here, but sort of how do we improve the politics of the modern university away from, because the right wing loves to exaggerate this. And it really, Lukács wrote about how the German fascists were the first ones to conflate liberalism with Marxism. Now, I'm not calling Trumpism necessarily fascist. That's a whole other debate. But they love to do that, right? They love to take milquetoast, liberal academics and say it's Marxist. When we all know, or at least you and I know, and hopefully everybody listening knows, that Marxism is extremely rare in the academy, as I see it.
Yes, absolutely.
What are your thoughts?
Well, absolutely, it's rare, and I think the idea that the professoriate is the enemy, this has been the case within the United States, at least. This has been the case since the 60s. Johnson thought this. Nixon thought this. I mean, Vance is just taking this playbook out of Nixon, basically. And of course, this is because they're anti-democrats. They do not want a democratic society, and they don't want challenge. Look at the saga of Socrates himself. When the people wanted revenge, they came for the one who questioned everything. They put him on trial and they executed him. And that's not only an allegory of what's happening today. I think that the culture wars, the idea of questioning that whether you should have a society that is open to transformation, and this is partly what's happening, is that people started to question the traditional family structure. People started to question the norms of sexuality in the 1960s, right? This is part of what the ontological versus the ontic is about. It's like, wait a minute, maybe this doesn't have to be this way. Maybe homosexuality can be seen as a valid form of living one's life. And the more that this happens, and the more that women say, like, I don't think that, maybe I don't want a kid. And this butts up against those who want to conserve, those who want a constricted form of life and experience. That's how I characterize the right. On the one hand, form an alliance with those who basically want to rip apart the nation state and the administrative state because they want that kind of neo-feudal capacity to just go wherever they want, destroy whatever they want, extract what they want, exploit whom and whatever they want. People, I think there's a sense in which the university has failed in many ways because of over-specialization, because of a kind of lack of enforcing even standards of education within its own. I mean, in graduate school, I remember people who are getting PhDs that I'm just like, I just don't believe this person should have a PhD. They lack the general command of the field of that they have this degree in. And I felt that was like irresponsible. And I think it was irresponsible because they're not going to be qualified to be able to field certain questions or deal with certain issues. And I think that whether this is a left thing, a liberal thing, whatever, I don't know. But there is a sense in which there's a humanistic purpose of the university, which, by the way, is new. The university was almost always, through history, a bastion of conservatism. It usually trained priests and pastors and theologians. That's what it did for the most part, until the 20th century. I think reclaiming this is also about intrinsically now an anti-capitalist discourse, because how do you justify a liberal arts education in a world that says that you have to be trained to do something? So I think the humanist, when you return to the humanist discourse, the work before you gets larger, because there's so many sectors of society where the battle needs to be fought. And in a certain way, if you're an Althusserian or if you're a real orthodox Marxist, you just sit back like you're in the movie theater, because you're like, well, Marx said this is going to happen. It's all going to crash. Look at the stock market today. I told you so. The falling rate of profit. I'm not a part of this. And that's just not acceptable anymore. I mean, that may be very convenient for intellectuals, for some intellectuals. I'm definitely not with a broad brush. But the more that the humanistic discourse opens up, the more you realize it is in every sector of society, every sphere. So in some ways, it starts, if you are at the university, I think it has to start with with how you deal with curriculum questions, how you deal with the administration's overreach into academic affairs, and I think and how you teach your classes, and how you treat students, and what kind of a world that you want to introduce them to. And I think these things can make a difference in the university experience. that can keep the torch alight.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you very much for coming back on my show. This has been, as always, extremely enjoyable, thought-provoking. I probably have a bunch more questions for you, but I want to respect your time. Maybe at some point in the future, I might invite you to join me to talk in a more focused way about your work in psychoanalysis and group studies of groups, studies of identity that you've been also writing about, and Erich Fromm, who I'm much less familiar with, but is Fromm your favorite psychoanalytic theorist? Is that fair to say?
I don't think that's true, but I would say that I think Fromm offers the most robust paradigm for a synthesis of psychoanalysis with the social. I would say that. I mean, for clinical work, not necessarily, but for as a way of understanding or setting up for us a paradigm for discussing the psyche with the social. I think he offers us a great set of theories to start to build a foundation on. And I did train at an institute that was co-founded by Fromm, so
Oh wow,
it was kind of in the mix a bit, but and Sullivan and people like that.
As a final send-off, might we ask how the Lukács work is going in terms of trying to, if you're aware of this, trying to translate the ontology of social being, get more into English? If you're aware of that, I'd love to know that, and we'd also love to know what's next for you in your own scholarship, in your own writing.
Well, my knowledge of what's been happening is there is an effort underway. I think it was a few years ago, the Lukács scholar Richard Westerman reached out to me. He said he wanted to know if the two of us could translate the entire ontology of social being together, and I was totally down for that. But then we found out that Brill was kind of doing this already. So the complete aesthetic has been translated into English by Lukács, and that same team is now working on the ontology. That's my understanding. So we kind of put that on the back burner since someone else had beaten us to it, which was fine. But I was definitely up for translating that because that does need to be studied. And I am working on completing 2 books, hopefully within the next year. The first is on the decline of the democratic mind, and that talks a lot about, this is a theory that I'm kind of putting forward about psychoanalysis, the relevance of psychoanalysis for these same questions about democracy and its decline and the attraction of non-democratic and anti-democratic forces in modernity. That's more of a psychoanalytic work. And the other is called The Republican Reinvention of Radicalism, which is an attempt to create a radical Republican post-liberal political theory that includes, Marx and Machiavelli and Rousseau and Hegel, and the idea of reviving that as a structure of thought, as a political theory that can counterpose to liberalism and offer us a more progressive, inclusive way forward for a kind of more just democratic society.
Fabulous, Michael. It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to have you. And
Thanks,
my audience always benefits greatly from your insights and your work. Thanks again.
Thank you.